Opening the center immediately creates dynamic attacking chances and demands a response from your opponent to contest crucial squares. Setting up a robust pawn chain for French defense, preparing for a solid, often cramped, but resilient game. Establishing central dominance, preparing for piece development. Challenging White's central grip immediately sets up a dynamic, unbalanced struggle from the outset. Preparing for a solid French defense structure, this knight sidesteps immediate confrontation, aiming for future queenside development. Preparing for castling, Black gently develops the bishop, eyeing the central e4 pawn and reinforcing the d5 pawn's defense. Gaining central space, this thrust pushes Black's knight, forcing a decision while opening attacking avenues. Challenging White's pawn chain aggressively, c5 aims to disrupt the center and open lines for counterplay. Solidifying the center's grip, this move anticipates Black's queenside counterplay and prepares for a pawn chain advance. Opening the center immediately invites confrontation and a race to develop attacking pieces toward the king. Securing the center's central square with this pawn recapture fosters a solid pawn chain and prepares for central expansion. Asserting central influence with the knight, Black aims to contest the open lines and disrupt White's pawn structure, hinting at aggressive counterplay. Solidifying the center's foothold and preparing to reroute the knight for active central participation. Unlocking a passed pawn is a bold, albeit double-edged, attempt to seize the initiative on the king side. Focusing development, the bishop aims to support the central pawn structure and prepare for castling. Unleashing the queen immediately disrupts White's pawn structure, creating immediate tactical opportunities and demanding a precise response. Leveraging the discovered attack to deflect the queen from its useful role. Securing control of the long diagonal with the bishop disrupts White's pawn chain and prepares for central pawn breaks. Repositioning the knight allows for a potential kingside attack and frees up the f3 square for a rook, while preparing for the upcoming central pawn battle. Liberating the queen from its awkward pin, this exchange clears a path for active piece play while creating a promising central pawn majority. Unblocking the queen's diagonal after Black's forced piece exchange solidifies central control and prepares for queenside expansion. Exchanging queens simplifies the position, transitioning swiftly towards an endgame where active piece play will prove paramount. Recapturing with the king initiates an immediate endgame scenario, creating a pawn imbalance and potentially exposing the monarch. Developing the knight allows for better central control and prepares for castling, while the king's position remains exposed. Opening the queenside diagonal to pressure the queenside pawns and potentially disrupt Black's development. Developing the bishop here aims to challenge White's control of the queenside and prepare to bring the knight into the game. Reinforcing the e5 pawn's outpost and preparing for potential pawn storms across the center. Securing the king's safety now allows concentration on developing remaining pieces and challenging the open files. Concentrating forces along the open c-file creates immediate pressure and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Establishing presence on the open c-file offers counterplay and prepares for potential piece activity. Preparing to double rooks on the c-file, applying pressure and disrupting Black's queenside development. Challenging White's bishop on b5, this pawn move initiates a dynamic pawn race on the queenside. Trading bishops clarifies the pawn structure on the queenside, impacting the long-term fight for central influence. Liberating the bishop from the king's shadow creates dynamic counterplay on the open c-file. Reclaiming the open c-file with the rook, preparing to challenge Black's central pawn structure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, Black prepares for pawn breaks while White's rook becomes less active on the third rank. Repositioning the rook to the central file aims to exploit the open c-file and potentially tie down Black's remaining pieces. Focusing on activating the rook, this move prepares to contest the now open b-file. A bold knight repositioning, aiming to destabilize Black's queenside pawns and potentially initiate a kingside assault. Swapping off a rook frees the c-file for black's knight and aims for simplification, though it does give white a slight open file advantage. King centralization now offers active defense and potential counterplay, as the queens have departed. Reactivating the knight to control central squares, now that the queens are off, is a sound repositioning effort. Repositioning the rook to support the pawn majority on the queen side offers better long-term prospects than passive piece play. Reactivating the monarch from its pawn shield offers little immediate benefit, perhaps aiming for a distant outpost. Probing for weaknesses, white aims to expand on the king side and potentially create a passed pawn. Challenging white's central occupation, this knight redirection prepares to contest open files and free the rook from passive defense. Seeking to solidify central influence and prepare for eventual king activity, white repositions for a more robust pawn structure. A bold knight maneuver, aiming to disrupt the queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the c-file after further exchanges. Pawns advance, aiming to disrupt black's knight outpost. Recapturing the knight re-establishes symmetry, but the knight's new square offers little influence on the center. Launching a flank pawn storm to gain space and pressure black's defensive setup. Opening the center now invites a tactical skirmish, potentially exposing the kings as pieces begin to vacate their posts. A bold sacrifice, opening lines and forcing the king into a precarious position. Exchanging knights here simplifies the position, opening lines for the rooks and creating immediate pressure on the d-pawn. Clearing the central file now allows the rook to dominate the open column. A bold bid for the d-file, aiming to disrupt white's rook coordination and potentially create counterplay. Mobilizing the monarch to a more active square, preparing for potential pawn pushes. Reclaiming the open file with the rook is a sound positional decision. Repositioning the rook to contest the open file offers better defensive coverage. Shifting the rook to the open file initiates a dangerous counterplay, threatening to unravel white's pawn structure. Securing the king behind a pawn wall feels passive, while black's rook actively eyes the king's weak squares. Reclaiming the open file, the rook aims to rejoin the fray and challenge white's queenside initiative. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure prevents black's knight from advancing further and reinforces white's pawn majority. Probing for a breakthrough, black advances the pawn, aiming to create queenside dynamism and challenge white's pawn structure. Relocating the monarch to this square offers central refuge, preparing for an eventual pawn push up the d-file. The rook embarks on an ambitious journey, seeking outpost opportunities while potentially creating tactical imbalances. Sensing an endgame advantage, white solidifies the queenside pawn chain, aiming to restrict black's rooks and create a secure outpost. This clever forcing move exploits the king's compromised shelter and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure. Activating the monarch into the fray, a king's bold foray into open territory. The rook's audacious sortie aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure by threatening pawn captures. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aggressively probes black's queenside defenses, seeking to dismantle their pawn structure before any counterplay can materialize. Strengthening the kingside pawn structure proactively defends against potential breakthroughs on that front. Reactivating the knight after its forced retreat injects fresh attacking potential into white's position. Shifting the king offers better support for a potential pawn advance, while also keeping an eye on the queenside initiative. Activating the knight to centralize it and prepare for an attack on the weakened kingside pawns. The king's reign ends here, forced into a perpetual dance with the rook and offering the final piece to white's advancing pawns. The king retreats to safety, but the knight on e5 now feels quite exposed. The king's sudden shift to the queenside now exposes it to the rook's potential raids. Challenging black's isolated king by activating the rook on an open file. Embracing the central diagonal, black's king boldly steps onto a more active square. Unleashing a knight fork to disrupt black's rook and king coordination. The king must now retreat, abandoning the fight for the center. The rook advances to eye the king's escape squares and menace the pawn on a5. Relocating the king now exposes it to a critical discovered attack, a serious positional miscalculation. Securing the king and removing the defender with a tempo. Exposing the king to the rook's rampage, this move surrenders the crucial g7 square and invites further complications. The rook now aggressively claims the 7th rank, targeting weaknesses and limiting the black king's escape routes. Repositioning the rook to the open b-file aims to contest the semi-open file and potentially threaten white's king. Activating the king for the endgame becomes paramount with this king march. Sacrificing the rook offers a glimmer of counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's newly consolidated advantage. Activating the king now is crucial for attacking the weak pawns and creating endgame chances. The black king's shelter has evaporated, leaving it exposed to the rampant white monarch. The king scurries forward, a bold advance to exploit the open lines and newfound space. The rook now retreats, seeking better central influence and preparing for a potential rook lift. King's bold march opens a decisive attack, aiming to dismantle black's pawn shield. Bringing the rook into the game offers a chance for counterplay against white's exposed monarch, but its placement might be premature. Capitalizing on the exposed black monarch, white seizes the crucial 7th rank, threatening immediate mating patterns. The rook's repositioning opens a diagonal, potentially threatening the exposed white king and preparing for a determined pawn push. Securing the king on d5 allows white to consolidate and eye the vulnerable black pawns on the queenside. Claiming the open file with the rook seems a touch optimistic given white's centralized king and attacking prospects. Securing the rook on the 7th rank initiates a powerful endgame bind, aiming to simplify into a winning pawn majority. The rook's journey to the 1st rank now aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially creating passed pawns. Securing the passed pawn on the queenside offers a clear path to victory and simplifies the endgame. Disrupting white's control of the open file by repositioning your rook is a sound idea. Securing the central space with the king opens up possibilities for pawn promotion and king activity in the endgame. Seeking respite from the relentless pawn push, the rook finds a temporary outpost. The king's path to safety is now wide open, time to consolidate those passed pawns. King's safety evaporates as the rook infiltrates, forcing a desperate endgame. The king's exposed position now dictates an immediate defensive posture to avoid further complications. Forcing a retreat, the rook secures a perpetual check or eyes a potential queenside infiltration if white's king ventures further. Preserving the passed pawn's march to promotion is paramount now. Seeking refuge in the center, the rook hopes to disrupt white's passed pawn advance. Seizing the open file with the rook solidifies white's material advantage. Black's rook infiltrates, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially seize control of the now open c-file. Repositioning the rook to the king's flank aims to pressure black's weakened pawn structure and prepare for an eventual king hunt. Repositioning the king now is essential to support the rook's infiltration and prevent any counterplay. Squeezing black's position further by advancing the pawn, restricting escape routes for the rook. Unleashing the rook to infiltrate the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially threaten the monarch. Clearing the kingside allows white's monarch to finally seek safety. The king retreats to a safer square, avoiding potential checks and regrouping for the endgame. The king is now exposed, opening up lines for immediate counterplay. Rerouting the rook to the central files aims to disrupt white's pawn advance and create counterplay. Pivoting the rook to the central rank aims to disrupt black's potential regrouping and secure a stronger outpost.